Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Victor Newman had faced confessions before, tearful affairs, desperate betrayals, calculated lies, but nothing prepared him for the raw terror in Sienna Bacall's eyes as she stood trembling in his study, the door locked behind her, the air thick with power and menace, her voice cracking as the words burst out of her like a dam finally breaking. "Don't kill me," a plea so naked and unfiltered that even Victor, a man who had stared down enemies and sent rivals running with a single glare, felt something unfamiliar freeze him in place, because this wasn't manipulation or melodrama, this was survival, and as Sienna backed away, hands shaking, she confessed that everything he thought he knew about Matt Clark, about Mitch Bacall, about the carefully constructed narrative of loyalty, strategy, and calculated ambition, was a lie built on fear, coercion, and blood, and as she spoke, Victor's legendary composure cracked, his eyes narrowing not with anger but with shock as she admitted she had never been free, never in control, that every move she made, every silence she kept, was dictated by Matt's threats, his promises of destruction if she ever told the truth, her voice rising and falling as she explained how Matt had woven himself into her life like a parasite, isolating her, convincing her that the Newmans would destroy her if she ever went to them, that Victor would crush her without a second thought. And that was why she had played her role so perfectly, why she had lied to Noah, to Sharon, to Nick, even to herself, until the weight of it all became unbearable, and as Sienna confessed that Matt had staged events, planted evidence, manipulated outcomes to make himself indispensable while quietly setting traps for the Newman family, Victor felt the room spin, because this wasn't just betrayal, it was a long game aimed directly at his empire. And when Sienna sobbed that Matt had ordered her to keep secrets about crimes she never committed but would be blamed for if she spoke up, Victor's face went cold, the silence stretching so long it felt like time itself had stopped, and in that silence, Sienna finally told him the worst truth of all, that Matt had faked vulnerability, faked love, faked remorse, all to get close enough to Victor's inner circle to destroy it from within, and that every time Victor thought he was 3 steps ahead, Matt had already anticipated him, using Sienna as both shield and weapon, and when she cried that she had begged Matt to let her walk away, that she had tried to leave, Victor clenched his jaw as she revealed the threats, how Matt promised that if she ever betrayed him, Noah would pay, Sharon would suffer, and Genoa City would burn piece by piece, and for the first time in years, Victor Newman was silent not by choice but because his mind was racing faster than his voice could follow. As Sienna admitted she had delivered false information, rerouted meetings, and even misled Victor himself under duress, all while believing she was already dead if she failed, and when she screamed that she never wanted this life, never wanted to hurt anyone, that she had been trapped long before Victor ever suspected her, something shifted in the room, because Victor could see it now. The fear wasn't performative, the confession wasn't strategic, it was the unraveling of someone who had been holding her breath for too long. And as she finally whispered that Matt had planned to let her take the fall for everything once his endgame was complete, Victor's eyes darkened with a fury far colder than rage, because this wasn't just about betrayal, it was about a predator who thought he could outplay the Newmans by hiding behind a terrified woman, and when Sienna collapsed into a chair, shaking, insisting that she had proof, that she could show Victor the recordings, the messages, the contingency plans Matt had prepared, Victor didn't move, didn't speak. Didn't even blink, his silence more terrifying than any threat he could have made, because in that moment, Victor realized that Matt hadn't just infiltrated his family, he had underestimated how far Matt was willing to go, and as Sienna finished her confession by admitting that even the moments Victor thought Matt was helping the Newmans had been calculated to weaken them, to pit them against each other, to make them doubt their instincts, Victor finally spoke, his voice low and deadly calm, asking one simple question that made Sienna's blood run cold: how long? And when she answered that it had been happening for years, that Matt had been planning this long before Genoa City ever noticed him, Victor closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the magnitude of the deception, because this confession didn't just expose Matt, it shattered the foundation of trust within the Newman family, calling into question every decision, every alliance, every supposed victory, and as Victor stood, towering over Sienna, she flinched, certain this was the moment she would pay with her life, but instead, Victor stunned her by saying nothing, his silence louder than any verdict, because he was already recalculating, already shifting the board, already deciding how to dismantle Matt piece by piece, and as Sienna realized she was still breathing, still alive, she understood that her confession had changed everything, not just for her, but for Victor Newman, a man who now knew the truth about Matt, a truth so explosive it would ripple through Genoa City, fracture loyalties, ignite vengeance, and mark the beginning of a reckoning that Matt Clark would never see coming. The silence that followed Victor's chilling stillness felt endless, a void so heavy Sienna could barely breathe, and yet it was in that quiet that the true danger crystallized, because Victor Newman thinking was far more terrifying than Victor Newman shouting, and as he slowly turned away from her, staring out the window as if Genoa City itself were a chessboard laid at his feet, Sienna realized her confession had not merely saved her life but condemned Matt Clark in ways far worse than death. Because Victor's voice finally came, low and razor-sharp, demanding every detail, every timeline, every lie Matt had ever forced her to tell, and Sienna, voice hoarse, gave it all to him in a torrent of truth, how Matt had reinvented himself as Mitch Bacall to erase his past, how he had studied the Newmans obsessively, memorizing their patterns, exploiting their emotional fault lines, how he knew Victor's greatest weakness wasn't power but family, and how he had planned to turn that love into a weapon, using Sienna as the connective tissue between chaos and control, and as she described secret meetings, burner phones, offshore accounts, and contingency plans labeled with Newman names like trophies, Victor's jaw tightened, the rage simmering beneath his calm finally beginning to show, because this wasn't just a threat to his empire, it was an insult, a challenge, a declaration of war. And when Sienna admitted that Matt had anticipated Victor's every possible response, including the possibility that she might eventually confess, Victor's eyes flashed, because that meant Matt believed himself smarter than Victor Newman. A mistake no one survived, and as Sienna revealed that Matt had planted seeds of distrust between Nick and Adam, subtly nudged Nikki into moments of doubt, and manipulated Sharon's instincts by feeding her half-truths wrapped in fear, Victor felt the impact ripple through him like an aftershock, because the fractures in his family suddenly made terrible sense, and when Sienna whispered that Matt's final move involved framing a Newman for a crime so catastrophic it would destroy the family name forever, Victor spun back toward her, demanding to know which one, and when she said she didn't know, that Matt kept that card hidden even from her, Victor's face hardened, because uncertainty was unacceptable, and as he ordered her to hand over every shred of proof, Sienna hesitated only a second before pulling a flash drive from her purse, her hands trembling as she admitted it was the only insurance she had left, the only reason she was still alive, and Victor took it without comment, the weight of it heavy with consequences, and as he told her she would remain under his protection until further notice, Sienna broke down, the relief and terror colliding as she realized she had traded one captor for another, but this one, at least, wanted her alive. And as Victor summoned his security team with a single call, instructing them to move discreetly, Sienna understood that the war had already begun, because Victor Newman never reacted, he retaliated, and while Sienna was escorted away, Victor stood alone, absorbing the magnitude of what he had learned, the realization that Matt Clark had not only infiltrated his family but had nearly succeeded in dismantling it from within, and as Victor replayed every recent betrayal, every misstep, every moment of doubt, he saw Matt's fingerprints everywhere, and the fury that followed was absolute, cold, and surgical, because this wasn't about revenge, it was about erasure, and across town, as Matt sensed the shift in the air, the subtle tightening of the net he never believed could touch him, he dismissed it as paranoia, unaware that Victor now knew his true face, his methods, his endgame, and as Nick confronted Sharon with questions sparked by Victor's sudden intensity, the truth began to ripple outward, shattering assumptions and exposing wounds that had never healed, and when Nikki sensed something was wrong and demanded answers, Victor gave her none, because some battles were fought alone, and as Adam noticed unusual movements within Newman Enterprises, whispers of internal audits and quiet asset freezes, he realized his father was preparing for something massive, something dangerous, and meanwhile Sienna, sequestered in a secure location, wrestled with the consequences of her confession, haunted by the knowledge that telling the truth had not ended her nightmare but transformed it, because Matt would know she'd betrayed him, and when Victor visited her again, his presence looming, she begged him to move fast, warning that Matt always had an escape plan, always stayed 3 steps ahead, and Victor responded with a calm certainty that sent chills down her spine, that this time, Matt had miscalculated, because he had underestimated the power of the truth when wielded by Victor Newman, and as Victor began executing a plan that involved turning Matt's own strategies against him, leaking false information, baiting him with opportunities too tempting to ignore, isolating his allies one by one, the trap tightened, and when Matt finally realized something was wrong, it was already too late, because the alliances he thought were solid crumbled, the resources he relied on vanished, and the protection he believed untouchable evaporated under Victor's relentless pressure. And as Matt confronted Sienna in a moment of raw fury, demanding to know what she'd done, she stood her ground for the first time, telling him it was over, that the lies were done, and when Matt laughed, insisting Victor would destroy her too, Sienna responded with a quiet strength she never knew she had, saying Victor already knew everything, and in that moment, Matt understood the depth of his failure, because Victor Newman knowing the truth was the one variable he had never truly planned for, and as the Newmans began to piece together the extent of Matt's manipulation, the family was shaken to its core, trust fractured, anger ignited, but unity forged in the fire of betrayal, and when Victor finally confronted Matt face to face, the power dynamic shifted instantly, because Matt was no longer the puppet master, he was exposed, cornered, and stripped of his illusions, and as Victor laid out the evidence, every lie, every crime, every betrayal, Matt realized the game was over, not with a dramatic explosion but with the quiet finality of a man who had already lost, and as Victor walked away, leaving Matt to face the consequences of his actions, Genoa City felt the aftershocks of Sienna's confession. Alliances realigned, secrets surfaced, and the Newman family emerged scarred but stronger, bound by the truth that nearly destroyed them, and Sienna, standing at the edge of a new beginning, understood that one confession had changed everything, not because it saved her, but because it exposed a monster who believed himself untouchable, and in Genoa City, nothing was more dangerous than believing you could outplay Victor Newman. In the aftermath of Victor's devastating confrontation with Matt, the reverberations continued to spread through Genoa City like a slow-burning quake, each tremor exposing new fractures, and nowhere was that more evident than inside the Newman family itself, where the truth about Matt's manipulation forced every member to confront how close they had come to destroying one another, because Nick replayed every argument, every moment he doubted his instincts about Sienna, and realized how expertly Matt had nudged him toward anger and mistrust, while Sharon struggled with guilt so sharp it stole her breath, knowing she had sensed something was wrong but had been deliberately steered away from the truth, and as Nicky finally cornered Victor, demanding answers he could no longer withhold, he revealed just enough to make her understand the scale of the betrayal without exposing Sienna's location, and Nicky, shaken to her core, saw with chilling clarity how Matt had played on her vulnerabilities, feeding her subtle insecurities and whispered fears, and Adam, always attuned to power shifts, recognized that this wasn't just another enemy, it was a reckoning that would redefine the family, and as Victor began quietly undoing the damage, reversing deals, restoring alliances, and neutralizing threats Matt had planted months earlier, Sienna remained hidden, guarded, and constantly looking over her shoulder, because even with Victor's protection, fear had rewired her instincts. Every sound making her flinch, every shadow reminding her of how close she'd come to death, and when Victor visited her again, not to interrogate but to inform, telling her that Matt was finished, that the evidence she'd provided had sealed his fate legally and financially, Sienna didn't feel relief the way she expected, because survival came with a cost, and that cost was living with the knowledge that she had been part of something monstrous, even if unwillingly, and when Victor told her that Newmans would never publicly name her as an accomplice, that her role would remain buried to protect her life, Sienna broke down again, overwhelmed not by fear this time but by the weight of mercy from a man she had been taught to see as merciless, and as the legal walls closed in on Matt, stripping him of leverage, allies, and escape routes, his desperation surfaced, because men like Matt didn't fear justice, they feared irrelevance, and when he attempted one final move, leaking partial truths to the press in a last-ditch effort to implicate a Newman and regain control of the narrative, Victor countered within hours, unleashing a carefully curated truth that destroyed Matt's credibility completely, turning him from mastermind to delusional manipulator overnight, and as Matt was taken away, screaming that Sienna would pay, that Victor would regret letting her live, Victor watched without expression, because vengeance had already been served in the most devastating way possible. Exposure, and yet even with Matt gone, the scars remained, because trust once broken never fully returns, and Nick struggled to face Sienna when Victor finally allowed a controlled meeting, the room heavy with unspoken pain, and when Sienna apologized through tears, not asking for forgiveness but simply acknowledging the hurt she'd caused. Nick realized that anger felt hollow compared to the truth, because the real enemy had always been Matt, and as Sharon joined them, admitting her own failures, the three of them began the slow, fragile process of rebuilding, while Victor observed from a distance, aware that his greatest victory wasn't Matt's downfall but the survival of his family, and still, the weight of what could have been lingered, because Victor knew how close he'd come to making a fatal mistake, how easily he might have dismissed Sienna's plea, and that knowledge haunted him more than he would ever admit. And as Genoa City settled into a new uneasy normal, whispers of the Newman War spread, cementing Victor's reputation once again as untouchable, but this time, there was a subtle shift. Because those closest to him saw something different in his eyes, a recognition that power without truth was fragile, and that even he could be deceived, and Sienna, slowly reclaiming her identity, began planning a future that wasn't defined by fear, knowing she would never be the same but also knowing she was alive because she chose truth over silence. And as she stood one evening watching the city lights flicker on, she understood the magnitude of what she had done. That one confession hadn't just destroyed a man, it had altered the course of countless lives, and somewhere in the distance, Victor Newman stood in his own window, the city stretching before him, calculating not his next move but the cost of the last one, because the truth about Matt had changed everything, and in Genoa City, nothing, no empire, no alliance, no family, would ever be quite the same again. And yet even as Genoa City tried to breathe again, the echoes of Matt's deception refused to fade quietly, because truths like that never simply disappear, they linger, demanding to be reckoned with, and Victor found himself awake at night replaying Sienna's first words, the raw terror in her voice when she begged for her life, realizing how close he had come to becoming the very monster Matt had painted him as. And that realization unsettled him more than any enemy ever had, because it forced Victor Newman to confront a truth he rarely acknowledged, that absolute power without absolute clarity could destroy everything he loved. And as the days passed, the Newmans began confronting their own guilt in private ways, with Nick throwing himself into work to outrun the anger he still felt toward himself, Sharon seeking forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved, and Nikki quietly vowing never again to let an outsider exploit her doubts, while Adam, ever observant, recognized that this crisis had subtly shifted his father, making him colder in strategy but sharper in instinct, more dangerous precisely because he now understood the cost of misjudgment, and Sienna, slowly stepping out from Victor's shadow, faced a different reckoning entirely, because survival didn't erase trauma, and every time she closed her eyes she heard Matt's voice, felt his control tightening, only to wake and remind herself that the lies were over, that the truth, however brutal, had set her free. And when she finally chose to leave Genoa City for a while, not running but healing, Victor ensured her path was clear, her past buried, a silent acknowledgement that without her courage, his family might have fallen, and as she left, Sienna carried with her the knowledge that one moment of honesty had rewritten destiny, not just her own but Victor's as well, because he would never forget the night a frightened woman shattered his certainty and forced him to listen. And as Victor stood alone once more, watching the city pulse beneath him, he understood that Matt's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating his power, it was believing the truth could be controlled forever, because in the end, it was a single confession that brought everything crashing down, and Victor Newman, frozen in shock then forged in resolve, emerged not unscathed but awakened, knowing that in Genoa City, lies may build empires, but truth, when finally unleashed, destroys them all. The final ripple came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was the one that lingered the longest, because even after Sienna was gone and Matt was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and police files, the knowledge of how close the Newman dynasty had come to collapse continued to haunt every victory, and Victor found himself pausing before decisive moves, not out of hesitation but reflection, weighing truth alongside power for perhaps the first time in his reign, while Nick and Sharon, forever altered by the ordeal, rebuilt their bond with a fragile honesty that refused to ignore the scars, choosing transparency over silence even when it hurt, and Nikki, steadier now, became the family's quiet anchor, reminding them that strength wasn't just domination but survival with integrity, and Adam, watching it all, understood that the legacy he would one day inherit had shifted, sharpened by betrayal but tempered by hard-earned awareness, and somewhere far from Genoa City. Sienna woke each morning still startled by peace, learning to exist without fear dictating her every breath, knowing she would always carry the weight of what she'd revealed but also the pride of having ended it. And as Victor stood one last time at the window of Newman Enterprises, the city reflecting back the man he had become, he accepted a truth he would never speak aloud, that the night Sienna begged for her life and told him everything had changed him as profoundly as it had destroyed Matt. Because empires could be rebuilt and enemies erased, but the knowledge that even Victor Newman could be deceived would forever keep him vigilant, colder, and paradoxically more human. And in Genoa City, where lies once ruled unchecked, a single confession had rewritten the rules, proving that sometimes the most devastating weapon wasn't power or fear, but the truth spoken at the moment it was least expected.